Professor, why do you think that we need to desperately seek Kenneth Waltz?
We need desperately seek Kenneth Waltz because Kenneth Waltz stops us talking nonsense. This was how Jean Elshtain put it a few years ago at a conference. I don't totally agree with her characterization in the sense that you can engage with Kenneth Waltz and you can still talk nonsense. But the great thing about Kenneth Waltz's work is that it stops you being irrelevant. And in my view, much of the work that gets done in international relations these days, though of some interest, is not relevant to the big and important things going on in the world. The big and important things in the world is a term that Kenneth Waltz himself uses. And the world these days, I think, is facing a world historical crisis which is as big as the one faced by Europe in the early 17th century that led to the 30 Years' War. And we need to think about these big and important things relating to who gets what, where and when across the world. And Kenneth Waltz's structural realism directs us directly to those big and important questions.
How do you think that the students of international relations can think about the international world in the way that E.H. Carr and Morgenthau once did?
The way that they can think about the world in the way that Carr and Morgenthau did, first of all, involves them reading Carr and Morgenthau, which very few students these days actually do. And I'm not blaming the students for this, I blame their teachers, many of whom don't take seriously the vast amount of excellent literature that exists in our field. And in part, some of this literature is totally ignored simply because it's given the realist label. And if it's got the realist label these days, then obviously it's thought to be simple-minded and not worth the time of the sophisticated theorists that we all are supposed to be these days. But actually, when you go back to look at the work of Carr, Morgenthau, Niebuhr, John Hertz, and a group of others, then you would see that their writing is not only intellectually very rich, but they are dealing explicitly with the sorts of problems of global reform. Not always, but often they're dealing very explicitly with these great problems of global reform that are critical to us meeting, with any hope of success, the problems that the world faces as we approach the decades towards the middle of this century. A period when the world population will go from 7 billion to 11 plus billion, when there are pressures of resource strain, water, food, energy, and when we may be facing quite significant issues relating to climate change that will affect very profoundly the environment in which all this takes place. So the first thing students should do is go back to the classics and throw their textbooks out of the window.
What do you think has been the greatest achievement in the international relations field since the end of the Cold War?
The biggest change in international relations since the end of the Cold War has been the shift from IR being a discipline dominated by one hegemonial way of thinking, that is realism, and instead it's become a discipline characterized by multiple alternative approaches to thinking about the world. Not only to thinking about the world, but to actually understanding the world that exists out there. These days we not only have different ways of thinking about how to think about the world, but we also think that we're looking at quite different worlds sometimes. As a result of this expansion of different theoretical perspectives. We now are far more theoretically sophisticated than people on the whole who wrote about international relations up to that point. And I said on the whole, I take out of that the great founding figures of certain ways of thinking, the Morgenthau's in the English school, Martin White, for example, in the World Order's Models project, people like Richard Falk. There were plenty of extremely sophisticated thinkers before writing about international relations, before the end of the Cold War. But I think we're all, as a general rule, much more sophisticated than we were then. The problem is that we are not using that additional degree of sophistication to try to unravel the great puzzles of international relations, the puzzles that stop humans living together in any more harmony than they have historically. A world that is still characterized by, in one way of thinking about it, a tyranny characterized by the dominance of the rich over the poor.
Thank you.
Thank you.